In the past 2 weeks, the podcast has explored civil-military relations, but today, the focus shifts to the West Philippine Sea. This vital body of water is not merely a geographical feature. It serves as a stage for conflict and cooperation, rich in resources like fisheries and untapped oil reserves. Over 2 series, the podcast has examined its complexities, including historical territorial claims shaped by colonial legacies and the heartfelt stories of local fishermen impacted by geopolitical tensions. Legal experts have clarified international law, making intricate concepts accessible, while policymakers have discussed the Philippines' strategic role in this dynamic region. The podcast effectively illustrates that behind every statistic lies a human story, emphasizing the need for informed dialogue. As the highlights are presented, listeners are invited to reflect on the intricate interplay of history, culture, and human experience that defines the West Philippine Sea. Now, let's dive into the key moments from this enlightening journey.
All right, let's jump right in, folks. Today we're heading into some pretty choppy waters.
Oh, yeah.
The South China Sea, to be exact.
Definitely choppy.
And I know you've all been following along at home.
Keep it up with the news.
So you know just how important these 2 new laws from the Philippines are?
Big developments for sure.
We're talking about Republic Act Num. 12064.
The Philippine Maritime Zones Act.
Right, and Republic Act Num. 12065.
The Philippine Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act.
And get this, both were just signed by President Marcos Jr. a few days ago.
Really shaking things up.
It's like the Philippines is basically drawing a line in the sand.
More like a line in the water.
Okay, a line in the water.
Exactly. They're laying down the law saying, this is ours.
It's a pretty bold move with some serious global consequences.
Huge geopolitical implications.
So let's break it down. The Maritime Zones Act is kind of like the Philippines pulling out this giant map and pointing.
Like, see this?
This is our exclusive economic zone we're calling DIBS.
Exactly. All the fish, oil, natural gas, you name it. It's theirs.
And they're backing it up by aligning their laws with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Gives them serious clout internationally.
Like, we're not making this up. The UN's got our back.
Exactly. They're playing by the book, so to speak.
And President Marcos Jr. himself has even said this is about the Philippines' commitment to protecting their maritime domain.
You can really feel that commitment.
But, you know, as you might expect, not everyone's thrilled about this.
Definitely ruffled some feathers.
China's reaction, well, it was like someone stepped on their brand new shoes.
Not happy at all. They immediately summoned the Philippine ambassador.
Issued a pretty stern protest.
Accused the Philippines of encroaching on what they see as their territory.
And they specifically pointed to places like Scarborough Shoal.
And the Spratly Islands.
Major flashpoints in this whole dispute for years.
Oh yeah, those areas have been contested for a long time.
And China didn't stop there. They also issued a warning.
Things could escalate.
Like, hey, you're playing with fire here.
Definitely upping the tension.
So yeah, this Maritime Zones Act is definitely a power move by the Philippines.
No question about it.
But how does the other law fit into all of this?
The Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act.
Yeah, that one.
Well, picture the Philippines like a giant house. Lots of doors and hallways, right?
Okay, I'm following.
This law is like the Philippines setting up specific paths through their house.
Designated routes.
Exactly, and saying, guests are welcome, but you have to use these paths. 2 going east-west and 1 north-south.
So they're not totally closing off their waters.
Not at all. International law guarantees innocent passage, you know.
Right, ships can still pass through.
Like this new law adds a layer of control. It's like having a guard at the door, checking IDs, making sure everyone follows the rules.
Makes sense. So they can actually stop ships from passing through?
They can suspend passage if there's a security risk.
Like if they think something shady is going on.
Exactly, like smuggling or something. And it's especially interesting for submarines.
Oh, how so?
They're basically saying, you can't just lurk underwater anymore. If you're using our lanes, you got to surface and show your flag.
Wow, that's pretty bold.
It is. It's all about asserting their sovereignty and having more control.
I can see that. And I read that these lanes have to be approved by the International Maritime Organization.
That's right. Got to get the UN's stamp of approval.
Like getting your house rules approved by the neighborhood association.
Doesn't like that.
Now, one thing that really struck me was this quote from Senator Tolentino, who was really pushing for these laws.
Oh, yeah. What do you say?
He called the Maritime Zones Act the birth certificate of the West Philippine Sea.
That's a powerful image.
It really is. It's like the Philippines formally claiming this area, even if China doesn't want to sign the paperwork.
And to reinforce that, they're even releasing a brand new map that clearly outlines their territory.
Making it official.
Exactly. This is ours. End of story.
Wow. It feels like the Philippines is taking a very different approach from the previous administration.
Definitely a shift in strategy.
The previous administration seemed more willing to try and get along with China.
A more conciliatory approach.
But President Marcos Jr. even said these laws reflect the Filipino character.
What do you think you meant by that?
I think it shows a real sense of pride and a willingness to stand up for what they believe in.
Like, we're not going to be pushed around anymore.
We know our rights and we'll defend them.
Exactly. So these laws are more than just legal documents.
They're a declaration of independence, a way for the Philippines to take control of their own destiny.
And it's going to be really interesting to see how China and the rest of the world respond to this new assertiveness.
Definitely a lot to unpack here. Make sure to join us for part 2, where we'll dive even deeper into the potential consequences of these laws. We'll look at the impact on regional relationships, the economic implications, and the role of international organizations.
And we'll also explore the potential for conflict, the possibility of cooperation, and what all this means for the future of the Philippines. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. It's like watching a chain reaction, you know?
How so?
Well, the Philippines makes this big move.
Draws that line in the water.
Exactly. And now everybody's watching.
Wondering what happens next.
Yeah, will other countries follow suit?
That's a great point. What about places like Vietnam?
Malaysia, Indonesia?
Yeah, they all have issues with China in the South China Sea, too.
Oh, absolutely. They've got their own territorial disputes.
So could these new Philippine laws embolden them?
Give them the courage to stand up to China.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
It's definitely possible. Think of it like this.
Okay.
You've got a group of friends,
Mm-hmm.
and there's this bully picking on them.
Right.
For a long time, nobody wants to fight back.
Too scared.
Exactly. But then, one of them finally stands up to the bully.
What happens then?
Well, that can give the others courage.
You realize they can stand up too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we might see a united front forming,
More Southeast Asian nations pushing back against China,
saying enough is enough.
drawing their own lines in the sand.
Exactly. It's a real possibility.
And what about the U.S.?
Ah, yes, the big player.
It's been pretty vocal about freedom of navigation in the South China Sea.
Oh, yeah, they've been sending warships through those waters,
Flexing their muscles a bit.
trying to show China they're watching.
So how do you think these new laws affect their involvement?
It's tricky for the U.S.
How so?
They've got this security alliance with the Philippines.
Right, a long-standing one.
So they want to support their ally,
But
they also don't want to provoke China too much.
to start a war.
Exactly.
Mm.
It's a delicate balancing act for them,
So they're walking a tightrope.
trying to find that sweet spot.
Support the Philippines without triggering a major international incident.
It's a tough position to be in.
Do you think these new laws actually increase the chances of a military conflict in the South China Sea?
It's hard to say for sure.
It's a complicated situation.
Very complex. Anytime you've got these overlapping claims and rising tensions,
It's a recipe for disaster.
there's always a risk things could spiral out of control.
So these laws could actually make things worse.
They could. But they could also be a way for the Philippines to strengthen their position without resorting to force.
So a show of strength.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, we're not looking for a fight, but we're ready to defend ourselves.
Okay, so it's a high-stakes game of strategy.
No doubt about it.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears for a minute.
Okay.
Let's talk about the economic side of things.
I'm all ears.
We've talked about fishermen and resources,
Right.
but what about other economic activities in the Philippines' EZ?
Their exclusive economic zone.
Right. Could this open up new opportunities for them?
Potentially?
We're talking about a potential gold mine here.
Really?
The EEZ is full of natural resources.
Like what?
Oil, natural gas, fisheries.
Wow. A real treasure chest.
Exactly. By clarifying their rights.
And these new laws
Right, the Philippines could attract foreign investment.
and kickstart development.
Exactly. Think of all the possibilities.
But wouldn't that just make China even angrier?
Possibly, yeah.
I mean, they claim rights to those resources, too.
That's true. But it also creates an interesting opportunity.
What's that?
Joint development agreements.
Joint development agreements.
Yeah, have you heard of those?
Not really. Explain it to me.
Okay, so imagine this.
Okay.
You and your neighbor both claim ownership of a lemon tree.
A lemon tree.
Yeah, it's right on the property line.
Half on your side, half on theirs.
Exactly. Now, you could constantly fight over who gets the lemons.
Sounds messy.
It would be. Or you could work together.
You share the lemons.
More than that, you share the costs of caring for the tree, you split the harvest.
Everybody wins.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the idea behind joint development agreements.
So instead of fighting over resources in the South China Sea,
The Philippines and China could cooperate and share the benefits.
that's a really interesting idea,
It is. Of course, it would require a lot of trust.
which is in short supply these days.
Yeah, and diplomacy.
Lots of talking.
Exactly. But if they could pull it off,
It could be a win-win.
absolutely. Everyone benefits.
So these laws have the potential to trigger conflict,
Definitely a possibility.
but they could also open doors for cooperation.
That's the thing about this situation.
What is it?
It's so unpredictable.
Like a choose-your-own-adventure story.
Exactly. Multiple possible endings.
So many moving pieces,
And the actions of each player can have huge ripple effects.
affecting the whole region.
The whole world, even
We've talked about regional relations,
the economic side of things.
the risk of conflict, even the possibility of cooperation.
It's a lot to consider.
But what about international organizations?
Ah, yes. The UN, ASEAN.
Do they have a role to play in all of this?
Absolutely. They could be crucial as mediators,
Helping to facilitate dialogue?
encouraging a peaceful resolution.
But isn't China against that kind of involvement?
You're right. They prefer to handle things bilaterally.
Directly with other countries.
No outside interference.
So it'd be like trying to herd cats,
You could say that.
trying to get everyone to agree.
It's tough. But as the situation gets more tense,
More pressure.
exactly, there might be more pressure from the international community.
To find a peaceful solution.
One that doesn't involve warships.
So even if China refuses to officially negotiate with a mediator,
These organizations can still play a role behind the scenes.
back-channel diplomacy.
Exactly. They can help build bridges, promote communication, and encourage everyone to play by the rules,
Like a referee standing by.
just in case things get out of hand.
Makes sense. So where does this leave the Philippines?
They're in a tough spot.
Between a rock and a hard place.
They want to stand up for their rights,
Protects their interests.
but they also don't want to provoke China.
A real balancing act.
So what's their best move? That's the million-dollar question.
What do you think?
Well, there are no easy answers.
It's complicated.
They need to keep strengthening relationships with other countries.
Build alliances.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And build up their defenses.
Make it clear they're not an easy target.
Deter any aggression. And they need to use international law and organizations to their advantage.
Smart strategy.
It's a combination of diplomacy, deterrence, and legal savvy.
So a multi-pronged approach.
Exactly. It's a tough road ahead for the Philippines.
Navigating these choppy waters.
But amidst all this talk about international relations and legal maneuvering,
There's something we haven't really talked about.
what's that?
The human element.
The Filipino people themselves.
How are they feeling about all of this?
That's a great question. Public opinion is mixed.
Makes sense. It's a complex situation.
There's a lot of national pride,
Wanting to protect their territory.
of course. But there's also realism.
They know they're up against a powerful adversary.
China's not easy to mess with.
So some people support these new laws,
See them as a necessary step.
while others are worried.
Concerned about the consequences.
It's understandable.
It's a high-stakes situation with no guarantees.
But let's go back to those joint development agreements.
Ah, yes, a potential solution.
Could that really work?
It's a long shot, but not impossible.
Tell me more.
Both China and the Philippines have a lot to gain from a stable South China Sea.
Peace and prosperity.
Exactly. Imagine them collaborating instead of fighting.
Working together on fishing, tourism, energy.
It sounds utopian, but it could happen.
It'd be a huge win for everyone.
Absolutely. The whole region would benefit.
So there's a glimmer of hope
There is, but it would require a huge shift in thinking.
from both sides.
They'd need to build trust, compromise, and be patient.
That's a tall order.
It is. But if they can pull it off,
Joint development could be a game changer.
a real turning point.
So, big picture, what's the takeaway for our listeners?
The South China Sea situation is complex and always changing,
There's no easy answers.
and the stakes are high.
Every decision matters.
The choices made by the Philippines, China, and others in the coming years will have a huge impact.
On the region, and maybe even the world.
It's a reminder that we need international law, diplomacy, and peaceful solutions.
Because these disputes can have global consequences.
Exactly. But even with all the challenges,
There's still hope for a better future.
always, It's up to us to stay informed and engaged.
And hopeful.
Exactly. The story's still being written.
It's like we're watching a ship, you know?
Sailing into uncharted waters.
Exactly. No one knows where it'll end up, but...
Lots of uncertainty.
Yeah, with all this talk about diplomacy and geopolitics and legal stuff...
High-level stuff.
It's easy to forget about the people at the heart of it all.
The everyday Filipinos.
Right. What does this all mean for them?
It's a crucial question. Imagine you're a fisherman in the Philippines going out every day.
Trying to make a living.
Exactly. To put food on the table for their families.
And suddenly these new laws come into play.
Adding another layer of complexity.
It's like they're stuck in the middle.
Caught in this international tug of war.
On one side, their own government.
Asserting its rights.
And on the other, you've got Chinese vessels patrolling.
Sometimes even using force.
To keep Filipino fishermen away from their traditional fishing grounds.
A tough situation.
Absolutely. And it's not just about fishing either.
Right.
These new laws could impact tourism.
Offshore energy exploration.
Even the prices of things people buy every day.
The ripple effects could be huge.
It's like these laws could reshape the whole Filipino economy.
Potentially, yes.
But let's be honest, there's a big elephant in the room here.
Oh, yeah, I know who you're talking about.
China. And they're not known for backing down.
That's an understatement.
They've made it very clear they're not happy.
They see these laws as a direct challenge.
To their claims in the South China Sea.
And they're not afraid to use pressure.
Economic or military.
To get what they want.
Okay, so things could get messy. Is there any chance?
Any hope?
Yeah, that this could lead to something good.
It's a long shot.
But
it's not impossible. Think about it. Both China and the Philippines benefit from stability in the South China Sea.
Peace and prosperity.
Exactly. Imagine a future where they're not fighting.
But working together.
Collaborating on fishing, tourism, energy exploration.
It sounds too good to be true.
It does, I know. But stranger things have happened.
It'd be a win for everyone.
Absolutely. Not just China and the Philippines.
The whole region would benefit.
A more peaceful and prosperous future for everyone.
It's a beautiful thought. But realistically...
It'd require a huge shift in thinking on both sides.
Building trust.
Finding common ground.
Being willing to compromise.
All essential ingredients.
A tall order for sure.
It is. But if they can manage it, well...
Joint development could really change the game.
Potentially a major turning point.
So much at stake.
For everyone involved.
So for our listeners today...
What should they take away from all this?
Yeah, what's the key takeaway?
The situation in the South China Sea is complex and constantly evolving.
It's a moving target.
There are no easy answers, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Every decision has consequences.
The choices made by the Philippines, China, and other key players in the coming months and years will shape the future of the region.
And maybe even the world.
It really highlights the importance of international law.
Diplomacy.
And finding peaceful solutions to complex disputes.
Because these issues can have global repercussions.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even in the face of these huge challenges,
there's always a chance for things to get better.
Always. A possibility for cooperation and a brighter future.
It's important to stay hopeful.
Absolutely. We need to stay informed, engaged, and work towards a positive outcome.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion.
A real deep dive.
We've learned a lot about the South China Sea.
The legal complexities.
There's potential for conflict.
And the possibility of cooperation.
The stakes are high.
The next chapter is still being written.
We'll have to wait and see how it all unfolds.
But one thing's for sure.
What's that?
The choices made in the coming months and years will have a lasting impact on the region and the world.
Thanks for joining us today on this deep dive into the South China Sea.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper.
Welcome to our deep dive into the world of Philippine maritime security. We're about to explore a nation of over 7,100 islands, a place where life is inherently intertwined with the sea. But this deep connection also brings immense challenges, especially in the hotly contested waters of the South China Sea. We've got some dense research and policy papers to unpack today, but I promise it's going to be fascinating.
You're absolutely right. When we talk about security, we often think about land borders and armies. But for the Philippines, the sea is where so much is at stake.
Exactly. It's not just about beautiful beaches and fishing boats. We're talking about a nation whose very survival and prosperity are tied to the ocean. So let's start with this. The Philippines is what's called an archipelagic state. What does that even mean? And why is it so important in this context?
It's a great question. And it's key to understanding everything that follows. Imagine drawing a line around the outermost points of the Philippines Islands, instead of just having control over a narrow strip of water along the coast. An archipelagic state has sovereignty over all the waters within that line, connecting its islands into a single unit. It's like turning a bunch of scattered islands into one massive maritime territory.
Okay, I'm starting to see why that's a big deal. But didn't this concept face some pushback? I mean, giving a nation control over such a large expanse of ocean must have ruffled some feathers.
You're right. The Philippines, along with Indonesia, really had to fight for this concept to be recognized under international law. Before the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLS, many countries believed they had the right to sail freely through these archipelagic waters. But the Philippines argued that this would essentially cut their country into pieces, making it impossible to manage their resources or protect their security.
So winning that recognition under UNCLS must have been a massive victory for the Philippines.
Absolutely. It was a game changer. It gave them control over vital shipping lanes, fishing grounds, and potential resources like oil and gas. It also set a precedent for other archipelagic nations, strengthening their claims and shaping the entire landscape of maritime law.
That's fascinating. So we have the Philippines, this archipelagic nation, at the heart of some of the world's busiest shipping routes. But there's a problem brewing, right? Enter the South China Sea, a body of water that seems to be generating more disputes than waves.
Unfortunately, you're right. And these disputes aren't just about historical claims or legal technicalities. They have real-world consequences for the Philippines' security economy and the lives of its people.
Okay, let's dive into the heart of the matter. What exactly are these disputes about, and who are the key players?
Imagine a map of the South China Sea with overlapping circles drawn by different countries. Each circle represents a claim to a portion of the sea, its resources, and the islands within it. You've got China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and of course the Philippines, all vying for control.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster, with everyone trying to grab a slice of the same pie. But are these claims just based on who can draw the biggest circle on a map? I mean, there must be some kind of legal framework, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? And that's where UNCLS, which we discussed earlier, comes back into play. It sets rules for how far a country's maritime zones extend from its coastline, how to delineate boundaries, and how to manage resources. But the problem is interpretation is everything.
So even with a rule book, there's room for disagreement, especially when you have countries with competing interests and historical claims.
Exactly. And to complicate matters further, China has this infamous 9-dash line that they claim encompasses most of the South China Sea. It's like drawing a giant ambiguous U-shape that overlaps with the claims of almost everyone else.
Okay, that sounds pretty outrageous. How can they justify a claim that basically ignores everyone else's rights?
Well, China argues it's based on historical usage going back centuries, but most international legal experts say it has no basis under modern international law, especially UNCLS.
So we've got this volatile mix of overlapping claims, legal ambiguities, and a rising power like China asserting itself. What does all of this mean for the Philippines in terms of actual security threats? I mean, are we talking about the potential for actual conflict here?
The potential for conflict is a very real concern. Think about it. You have valuable resources like oil, gas, and fisheries at stake. You have vital shipping lanes that could be disrupted. And you have national pride and strategic interests fueling tensions.
That makes the South China Sea sound like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And there have been sparks, unfortunately. One of the most serious incidents was the 2012 standoff at Scarborough Shoal, a rich fishing ground claimed by both the Philippines and China. Chinese vessels blocked Filipino fishermen from accessing the area, and for weeks the two countries were locked in a tense standoff, raising fears of a military confrontation.
That must have been terrifying for the Filipino fishermen caught in the middle of this geopolitical chess match. So how did things de-escalate? Did one side back down?
Well, the Philippines eventually withdrew their vessels, but China effectively took control of Scarborough Shoal and has maintained a presence there ever since. It was a wake-up call for the Philippines, highlighting the stark reality of the power imbalance in the region.
Wow, so this isn't just a theoretical dispute playing out in courtrooms. It's having real-world impacts on people's lives and livelihoods. But we've been talking about external threats. What about internal security challenges? The Philippines is facing those too, right?
You're absolutely right. The Philippines has been grappling with internal conflicts, particularly Muslim separatist movements in the southern region of Mindanao, and this adds another layer of complexity to their maritime security concerns.
How so? I mean, how do these internal conflicts tie into the South China Sea disputes?
For one thing, these conflicts constrain the Philippines' resources and attention, making it even harder to focus on external threats. They also create potential vulnerabilities that external actors could exploit.
So you're saying that groups in the South China Sea could potentially take advantage of these internal divisions to advance their own interests?
It's a possibility that can't be ignored. There have been reports of links between some separatist groups and criminal networks involved in piracy and smuggling. And some analysts worry that external powers could try to influence or even support these groups to destabilize the region further.
That's a chilling thought. It sounds like the Philippines is facing a perfect storm of security challenges, both internal and external.
And we haven't even touched on the economic implications of these disputes yet. The South China Sea is not just a security concern. It's an economic lifeline for the Philippines.
Okay, let's shift gears then. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how these maritime disputes are impacting the Philippines' economy, and we'll dig into the complex web of foreign policy choices they're grappling with.
Stay tuned, because what happens in the South China Sea doesn't stay in the South China Sea. It ripples out, impacting global trade, regional stability, and the lives of millions.
Welcome back. We just explored how the South China Sea is shaping up to be a real security headache for the Philippines. But it's not just about military posturing or potential conflicts. This sea is also a treasure chest of resources. It's an economic lifeline for millions of Filipinos.
That's right. We're talking about a maritime area teeming with fish, potentially rich in oil and gas, and crisscrossed by vital shipping routes. The stakes are incredibly high, both for the Philippines and for the entire region.
Okay, so let's unpack the economic side of this equation. I know fishing is a huge part of life in the Philippines. How are these maritime disputes impacting that industry?
Imagine you're a Filipino fisherman who's been fishing in the same waters for generations. Suddenly, you find yourself facing harassment from foreign vessels, denied access to your traditional fishing grounds, or even risking detention by a foreign coast guard. This is the reality for many Filipinos who depend on the South China Sea for their livelihoods.
That's heartbreaking. It's one thing to talk about abstract disputes on a map, but it's another thing entirely when you see how it directly impacts people's lives and their ability to put food on the table.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual fishermen. The Philippines' entire fishing industry is under pressure. Overfishing, illegal fishing by foreign fleets, and damage to marine ecosystems are all taking a toll. This has serious implications for the country's food security and its economy.
So it's not just about who controls the waves.
Yeah.
It's about who controls the fish, and ultimately who controls the food supply. And what about the potential for oil and gas? I know there's been a lot of talk about untapped reserves in the South China Sea. How does that factor into the equation?
The South China Sea is believed to hold vast reserves of oil and gas. And for a country like the Philippines, which is heavily dependent on energy imports, that's a tantalizing prospect. The potential for energy independence, economic growth, and job creation is enormous.
But I imagine trying to tap into those resources in the middle of a territorial dispute is anything but easy.
You're absolutely right. Exploration and development become incredibly complex and risky in a contested environment. Companies are hesitant to invest when there's no guarantee of stability or legal certainty. And any attempt to drill for oil or gas could spark further tensions with China.
So it's like this huge potential windfall is sitting right there.
Yeah.
But the Philippines can't really access it without risking a major confrontation.
It's a classic dilemma, and it highlights the difficult choices facing the Philippines. Do they prioritize short-term economic gains, potentially at the risk of escalating tensions? Or do they focus on long-term stability and cooperation, even if it means delaying access to these resources?
It seems like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. And speaking of difficult choices, let's talk about how the Philippines is trying to navigate this whole situation. They've got a long-standing alliance with the United States, but they also need to maintain good relations with China, a rising economic powerhouse, right on their doorstep.
Yeah.
How do they balance those competing interests?
It's a delicate balancing act, for sure. On the one hand, the Philippines has this historic security alliance with the United States, formalized in the Mutual Defense Treaty. This treaty provides a degree of protection and acts as a deterrent against aggression.
So if things were to escalate with China, the Philippines could potentially call on the U.S. for support.
In theory, yes. But the treaty is not a blank check. It's subject to interpretation, and there are limits to what the U.S. is willing to do.
And I imagine relying too heavily on the U.S. could also backfire, potentially provoking China further.
Precisely. The Philippines doesn't want to become a pawn in a larger geopolitical game between the U.S. and China, so they're also actively pursuing diplomacy and cooperation both bilaterally with China and through regional mechanisms like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
So it's a multi-pronged approach.
Yep.
Leverage the U.S. alliance for security, engage with China diplomatically, and work with regional partners to try to find common ground.
Exactly. But let's not forget that the Philippines has its own agency in this situation. They're not simply reacting to external pressures, they're also taking steps to strengthen their own position and assert their rights.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, one key development was the 2009 Philippine Baselines Law. This law aimed to clarify the country's maritime boundaries and bring them into compliance with INCLS. But it also involves some strategic decisions about how to define those boundaries.
Right, remind me. We talked earlier about how INCLS recognizes the concept of an archipelagic state, which gives the Philippines control over a vast area of water. But didn't we also say that there were disputes about how to draw the lines around those outermost points?
You've got a great memory. And that's precisely where the 2009 law comes in. The Philippines had to decide how to classify certain features, particularly the Calayan Island Group and Scarborough Shoal. These areas are claimed by several countries, including China, and how they were categorized would have a major impact on the Philippines' maritime claims.
Okay, so walk me through the options. What were the different ways they could have approached this?
They could have opted for a maximalist approach, basically drawing a single baseline around all the disputed features, claiming them as part of the main archipelago. This would have given them a larger exclusive economic zone and potentially more control over resources.
But I imagine that would have also been incredibly provocative.
Yeah,
Essentially saying, we're claiming everything and we don't care what anyone else thinks.
exactly. It would have been a bold, some might say reckless move that could have triggered a major backlash from China and other claimants. So the Philippines opted for a more nuanced approach, classifying the Calayan Island Group and Scarborough Shoal as a regime of islands.
Okay, regime of islands. Explain that one to me. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Essentially, it means that these features are treated as individual islands with their own maritime zones,
Yeah.
rather than being lumped together with the main archipelago.
So instead of drawing one giant circle around everything, you're drawing smaller circles around these specific areas.
A perfect analogy. And this decision had significant implications. It allowed the Philippines to claim a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around each of these features, even though they're located far from the main archipelago.
I see. So it's a way of maximizing their maritime claims without being overly aggressive and provoking a major confrontation.
Exactly. It's a strategic move that attempts to balance asserting their rights under international law with the realities of the power dynamics in the region.
But didn't this decision also spark some controversy? I mean, I imagine some people within the Philippines felt like they were giving up potential claims by not taking the maximalist approach.
You're absolutely right. There were critics who argued that the regime of islands approach was too cautious, that it ceded ground to China, and that it weakened the Philippines' position in the long run.
So even within the Philippines, there's a debate about how assertive they should be in pursuing their claims. It seems like they're walking a tightrope trying to find that sweet spot between standing up for their rights and avoiding a dangerous escalation with a much more powerful neighbor.
And that tension, that balancing act, is at the heart of the Philippines' maritime security dilemma. They're trying to navigate a complex geopolitical landscape where the rules are often unclear, the stakes are incredibly high, and the outcome is anything but certain.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered a lot of ground, from the economic significance of the South China Sea to the strategic considerations behind the Philippines' actions. But as we've seen, the situation is constantly evolving.
And there are even more twists and turns ahead. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the most recent developments, including China's island-building campaign, the Philippines' legal victory against China's 9-line claim, and the potential paths forward for this nation at the crossroads of maritime power.
Don't go anywhere. This journey through the turbulent waters of the South China Sea isn't over yet. We've got more to uncover and more to analyze as we delve deeper into the complexities of Philippine maritime security. Welcome back to our deep dive into Philippine maritime security. We've established that the South China Sea is vital to the Philippines' survival, not just economically, but for its very security as a nation. We've also seen how China's growing assertiveness is throwing a wrench into things. So where do we go from here? What are the Philippines' options in this high-stakes game?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, unfortunately, isn't a simple one. The Philippines is facing a real dilemma, a classic David and Goliath situation.
Okay, so let's break down those options. What's on the table? What are the different paths the Philippines could take?
One option is to double down on the legal front. Remember that 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration? the one that basically invalidated China's expansive nine-dash-line claim.
Yeah, that was a huge win for the Philippines, right?
Yeah.
A victory for international law.
It was a significant victory, no doubt. It affirmed the Philippines' rights under UNCLS and sent a clear message that China's claims were excessive and lacked a legal basis.
So problem solved, right? Case closed.
If only it were that simple. The problem is that China has refused to recognize the ruling. They've basically ignored it, calling it null and void.
So we're back to the issue of enforcement. What good is a legal victory if the other side simply refuses to play by the rules?
Precisely. And that's the challenge with international law. It relies on countries voluntarily complying with rulings and respecting international norms. And when a powerful country like China decides to go its own way, there's not much the Philippines can do to force them to comply.
So what's the point of pursuing the legal route if it's essentially toothless?
It's not entirely pointless. The ruling still carries weight in the international community. It helps to delegitimize China's claims and rally support for the Philippines' position. It also strengthens their hand in diplomatic negotiations and provides a basis for future legal action if necessary.
Okay, so it's more about winning the battle of public opinion and building international pressure rather than expecting China to suddenly change course.
Exactly. It's a long game and it's not a guaranteed win, but it's one of the tools the Philippines has at its disposal.
So what other options are there? I mean, if international law alone can't protect them, surely they need to do more to defend themselves, right?
That brings us to the second option, strengthening the Philippines' own defense capabilities. This means investing in their Navy and Coast Guard, upgrading equipment and improving training to better monitor and protect their waters.
But let's be realistic. Can the Philippines, even with a military buildup, realistically match China's might? We're talking about a superpower with a rapidly growing Navy and a vast arsenal of weapons. It seems like a David and Goliath situation no matter how you slice it.
You're right. Trying to outspend and outgun China would be a fool's errand. But that doesn't mean the Philippines is powerless. Remember the concept of asymmetric warfare. It's not about matching your opponent blow for blow. It's about finding creative ways to exploit their weaknesses and make any aggression too costly to contemplate.
So instead of trying to build a fleet of aircraft carriers, the focus could be on more nimble, cost-effective strategies.
Exactly. Think about coastal defense systems, anti-ship missiles, and utilizing intelligence and surveillance to maximize their limited resources. It's about making it clear to China that any attempt to encroach on their territory will be met with fierce resistance, even if it's not a symmetrical fight.
So it's about raising the stakes, making the potential costs of aggression outweigh the benefits for China.
Precisely. And that's where the U.S. alliance comes back into play. Even if the U.S. doesn't directly intervene in every dispute, their presence in the region, their military exercises with the Philippines, and their commitment to freedom of navigation act as a deterrent. It sends a signal to China that they can't just bully their way around the South China Sea without consequences.
Okay, so we have the legal track, the military buildup, and the U.S. alliance. What other avenues are there for the Philippines to pursue?
One of the most important tools in their arsenal is diplomacy. And this means engaging on multiple fronts, bilaterally with China, through regional organizations like ASEAN, and by building coalitions with other countries that share their concerns about China's behavior.
I can see how working with other Southeast Asian nations through ASEAN would be crucial. There's strength in numbers, right?
Absolutely. A united front is much more powerful than any one country going it alone. ASEAN has been trying to negotiate a code of conduct with China for years, a set of rules to manage behavior in the South China Sea and prevent incidents from escalating into conflict.
So it's about finding ways to cooperate, even amidst these disputes, to establish some ground rules and prevent things from spiraling out of control.
Exactly. And it's not just about containing China. It's also about finding ways to work together on issues of common interest, like fisheries management, environmental protection, and search and rescue operations.
Because at the end of the day, everyone benefits from a stable and prosperous South China Sea, right?
Precisely. And that brings us to another intriguing option, the development of a blue economy in the region.
Okay, blue economy.
Yeah.
That sounds intriguing. What exactly does that entail?
Think of it as a way of sustainably utilizing the ocean's resources for economic growth. We're talking about everything from sustainable fishing and aquaculture to renewable energy, tourism, and even biotechnology.
So it's about shifting the focus away from just extracting resources like oil and gas and towards more holistic, sustainable approach to managing the ocean's bounty.
Exactly. And the Philippines has a lot of potential in this area. They have a vast coastline, abundant marine resources, and a growing tourism industry.
But I imagine developing a blue economy in the middle of a territorial dispute is no easy feat.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. By promoting a blue economy, the Philippines can strengthen its own position, build partnerships with other countries, and potentially even find common ground with China.
It's like flipping the script, turning a source of conflict into a catalyst for cooperation. I love that idea.
And it ties into the whole concept of human security that we touched on earlier. It's not just about protecting national borders. It's about protecting people's livelihoods, ensuring their access to resources, and building a future where everyone can thrive.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Philippine maritime security, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be pondering as they navigate this complex world?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the future of the South China Sea is not predetermined. It's being shaped right now by the choices that countries make, by the actions of leaders, and by the engagement of everyday citizens.
So what happens in the South China Sea matters. And even though the Philippines faces an uphill battle, they have a vital role to play in shaping a future where cooperation, not conflict, prevails.
Absolutely. And with that, I encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating dynamic region. Read up on the incidents we've discussed, delve into the legal arguments, and stay informed about the ongoing developments. The South China Sea deserves our attention because what happens there matters to the Philippines, to the region, and to the world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained a better understanding of the complex challenges and opportunities facing the Philippines in the South China Sea. Until next time, keep exploring. Okay, imagine this. You're on a ship.
Oh, this sounds intense already.
It is. It's a resupply ship in the South China Sea, and you're trying to reach this tiny outpost with like essential supplies, food, water, everything.
Right.
Out of nowhere, Chinese Coast Guard ships show up.
Oh, no.
And suddenly you're facing down water cannons.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Water cannons.
This isn't some action movie. This is the reality in the South China Sea.
Wow.
And this is why we're doing a deep dive today on this strategically vital waterway.
Vital is an understatement. And it's not just strategic. We're talking about trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
Trillions in trade flowing through there every year. I mean, think about it. It's about 3 times the size of the entire German economy.
That's wild.
If that gets disrupted, the whole world feels it.
Okay, that puts it into perspective.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the potential for things to escalate.
Yeah.
What exactly does that look like? What makes this particular body of water such a global flashpoint?
Well, think about it. You've got these trade routes and fishing grounds on the surface.
Right.
But underneath it all, you've got this tangled web of competing claims. You've got 6 nations all claiming parts of the South China Sea.
6?
Yeah, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, and Taiwan.
Wow. So it's not just a two-sided thing.
No, not at all. It's a whole mix of history, resources, strategic interests, all fueling these overlapping claims.
Okay, you brought a ton of research to this deep dive, and I got to say, the historical aspect always gets me. Where do we even begin with all of this?
Let's start with a map.
Okay.
Specifically a map from 1947
Okay.
from China. They call it the 9-dash line.
9-dash line. Why that name?
Well, because it literally has 9 dashes on it.
Okay.
And these dashes, they basically make this huge loop around a big chunk of the South China Sea.
So they're claiming all of that.
Yeah, the problem is a lot of those areas are claimed by other countries as their exclusive economic zones.
Hold on, exclusive economic zone. What's that?
It's basically like a country's backyard.
A backyard.
Yeah, extending out from their coastline. And within that zone, they have special rights to explore and use the resources there. So fishing, oil, gas, all that.
So China's saying, this whole backyard is mine, even though other countries are saying, no, it's ours?
That's the gist of it. Yeah. And to make things even more complicated, in 2016, a UN-backed court actually sided with the Philippines.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in a case challenging those historical claims.
So the UN said China's claim isn't valid.
Exactly. They said it has no legal basis, but China has completely ignored that ruling.
Okay, so we've got this historical baggage competing claims, and a UN ruling that one side just ignores. What could possibly go wrong?
A lot, unfortunately. And that brings us back to that incident you mentioned earlier with the water cannons.
Right, the one with the Philippine ship.
Exactly. That took place at a spot called the second Thomas Shoal.
And that's where the Philippines has that World War II era ship, the Sierra Madre, intentionally run aground. What's the point of that?
It's actually a pretty clever strategy. It acts as a physical marker of their claim to the shoal.
Oh, I see.
And it provides a base for a small group of Filipino troops.
So it's like a symbol of their determination to hold on to that territory.
Exactly. It's a powerful symbol. But the problem is it needs regular resupply. And China tries to block that sometimes using tactics like those water cannons.
It's like a high-stakes game of chicken playing out in the middle of this incredibly important shipping lane.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it. And this is one of the big reasons why the U.S. is so concerned about what's happening in the South China Sea.
Right. It's not just about protecting the Philippines, though, is it? They have that mutual defense treaty, but there's a bigger picture here.
You got it. The U.S. sees the South China Sea as essential for global trade and security.
Right.
They believe in upholding freedom of navigation for everyone, not just for themselves.
Makes sense.
And they want to see smaller nations like the Philippines able to assert their rights without being bullied by a bigger neighbor.
Okay, but China hasn't just been sitting back passively. They've been transforming the entire landscape with their island-building campaign.
You're absolutely right. It's one thing to draw lines on a map. It's another thing entirely to actually build islands and then fortify them with military installations.
It's like a real-life game of Risk.
Exactly.
They're turning these reefs and shoals into artificial islands with airstrips, listening posts, the whole 9 yards.
And then you add in the constant presence of their Navy and Coast Guard.
It's like they're saying, this is our territory and we're here to stay.
That's the message they're sending. And it's created a lot of anxiety, not just in the region, but internationally.
Speaking of anxiety, the Philippines' approach towards China has been interesting to watch. Their previous president, Duterte, seemed to favor closer ties with China.
He did. He downplayed the territorial disputes,
Right.
hoping to attract Chinese investment.
Okay.
He even basically set aside that UN ruling we talked about.
Wow.
But the current president, Marcos Jr., seems to be going in a different direction.
Yeah, he seems much more assertive.
Much more. He's prioritizing closer ties with the U.S., and he's pushing back against Chinese actions more forcefully.
He's not shying away from the conflict.
Nope. He's even invited journalists to witness those confrontations firsthand.
It's like he's saying, see for yourselves what's happening here.
Exactly. He wants the world to pay attention, and he's backing it up with action. He's granted the U.S. access to 4 additional military bases in the Philippines.
4 more.
Yeah. And 3 of those are really strategically important because of how close they are to Taiwan.
Which, of course, adds another layer of complexity to this whole geopolitical puzzle.
Oh, yeah. It gets even more complicated from here.
I bet it does.
Oh.
This is already a lot to take in.
And we're just getting started.
Well, let's dive deeper into all of this after a quick break.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back.
Hey.
Okay, so we're talking potential flashpoints, military buildups, shifting alliances. It's a lot to process.
It is.
But I'm curious, with all these moving pieces, what role could the U.S. actually play if things boil over in the South China Sea?
Well, that really comes down to the Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines.
Right, from way back.
Yeah, it dates back to 1951. But what exactly triggers U.S. involvement has always been a bit murky.
Okay.
Recently, though, there have been much clearer statements from the U.S. Any attack on Philippine aircraft vessels or armed forces in the South China Sea would invoke that treaty.
So that includes those troops stationed on that grounded ship, the Sierra Madre.
Absolutely. So if those water cannons were to escalate to something more serious, the U.S. could be legally obligated to respond.
Wow, the stakes are incredibly high. It's like a tripwire for a much larger conflict.
Yeah, you could say that.
But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the other nations in the region, especially those in Southeast Asia. They seem caught between a rock and a hard place.
They are. They rely on both the U.S. and China for trade and security.
So how do they navigate that?
It's a delicate balancing act, trying to maintain good relations with both sides without being forced to choose.
Can you give us an example of what that looks like in practice?
Sure, take Vietnam, for instance.
Okay.
They have their own territorial disputes with China and the South China Sea. So they understand the Philippines' concerns, but at the same time, China is a major trading partner for them.
One they can't afford to alienate.
Exactly. So it's this constant calculation of risks and rewards.
And it's not just Vietnam, right?
No. Many Southeast Asian nations are in a similar position. They rely heavily on trade with both China and the U.S.
Right.
And they also benefit from the security umbrella that the U.S. provides in the region. So they're walking this tightrope, trying to safeguard their own interests without becoming collateral damage in a bigger conflict.
We've painted a pretty intense picture so far.
Mm-hmm.
Competing claims, military buildups, a region on edge. Is there any hope for de-escalation?
There are some glimmers of hope.
Okay, good.
Despite the tension, both the U.S. and China have been trying to keep lines of communication open.
So they're talking.
Yes. There have been high-level meetings between military officials, signaling a desire to avoid a catastrophic confrontation.
That's encouraging.
It is, but the risk of miscalculation is always there. Even a seemingly minor incident could spiral out of control.
Like what?
Imagine a collision between a U.S. and Chinese warship, for example.
Oh.
What starts as an accident could easily escalate into something much more dangerous, especially given the heightened tensions and mistrust.
So it's like walking through a minefield blindfolded.
That's a powerful image, and it underscores why diplomacy and a willingness to find common ground are so crucial. The alternative, a full-blown conflict in the South China Sea, would be disastrous for everyone.
Absolutely. But how do you find common ground when the core issues are so deeply entrenched?
It won't be easy, but it starts with understanding the motivations and anxieties of all sides.
Okay, so break that down for us.
For China, it's about securing what they see as their historical territory and projecting their power. For the U.S., it's about upholding international law and ensuring freedom of navigation. And for the smaller nations in the region, it's about surviving and prospering in the shadow of these giants.
We've talked a lot about the geopolitical chessboard, but I'm also curious about the human element. What's life like for the people living in these disputed areas?
That's a crucial aspect that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
For fishermen, for example, the increasing tensions have made their livelihoods more dangerous and unpredictable. They're literally caught in the middle, trying to fish in waters that have become heavily militarized.
Wow, I hadn't thought about that.
And for the families of those soldiers stationed on that grounded ship, the constant threat of confrontation must be incredibly stressful.
It's a reminder that behind these abstract geopolitical maneuvers, there are real people whose lives are directly impacted.
Absolutely. And that human cost should never be forgotten.
Okay, so we've covered the historical claims, the military buildups, the alliances, the risk of miscalculation. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But I'm wondering, is there a way to connect all of this to something a little closer to home? Something our listeners can really grasp?
Well, remember when we talked about the potential for disrupted trade routes?
Right, the trillions of dollars worth of goods that flow through the South China Sea.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where tensions escalate to the point where shipping companies are forced to reroute their vessels.
Okay.
Or worse, suspend operations altogether.
That would be bad.
It would. That disruption could have a ripple effect throughout the global economy. We could see shortages of essential goods, skyrocketing prices, even economic recession.
So it's not just about some far-off territorial dispute. It could actually hit us in the wallet.
It could.
Yeah.
And that's why it's in everyone's best interest to find a peaceful resolution to this conflict.
You mentioned earlier that this whole situation feels like a countdown to a potential conflict. How close are we to that clock hitting zero?
It's impossible to say for sure, but there are certain indicators that we can look at. The pace of China's military buildup is certainly concerning.
In what way?
They're developing and deploying advanced weapon systems like hypersonic missiles and aircraft carriers that are specifically designed to challenge U.S. dominance in the region.
So they're not just building up their defenses, they're developing offensive capabilities that could directly threaten U.S. interests.
That's right. And that's why the U.S. is so concerned. They see China's actions as a direct challenge to their long-standing dominance in the region.
And that brings us back to the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines. If China were to directly attack a U.S. base in the Philippines, would that automatically trigger U.S. involvement?
It's not entirely clear. The treaty language is somewhat ambiguous.
Okay.
And there's been debate about whether it applies to attacks on U.S. forces stationed on foreign soil. But given the recent statements we discussed earlier, it's likely that any attack on U.S. forces in the Philippines would be met with a swift and forceful response.
It sounds like we're entering a dangerous new phase in this conflict.
We are, and that's why it's more important than ever to have informed and engaged citizens who understand the complexities of this issue and demand that their leaders prioritize diplomacy and peaceful solutions.
Speaking of complexities, we haven't even touched on the role of Taiwan in all of this. How does Taiwan fit into this already complicated equation?
Taiwan is watching the situation in the South China Sea very closely. They see it as a potential preview of what they might face if China ever decides to assert its claim over Taiwan by force. If the U.S. fails to back up the Philippines in a conflict with China, it could embolden China to take a more aggressive stance toward Taiwan.
So Taiwan is looking at the Philippines as a test case for U.S. resolve.
In a way, yes. And that's why Taiwan is strengthening its own defenses and seeking closer ties with the U.S. and other like-minded countries.
Okay.
They understand that their fate is intertwined with the broader regional dynamics and that the outcome of these disputes in the South China Sea could have profound consequences for their own future.
It's like a series of dominoes all lined up and waiting for the first one to fall.
That's a good analogy. And it highlights the interconnectedness of these regional security issues. What happens in the South China Sea doesn't stay in the South China Sea. It has implications for Taiwan, for Japan, for South Korea, even for countries farther afield.
So if we're talking about potential flashpoints, the South China Sea isn't the only one we need to be watching.
Not at all. The Taiwan Strait is another potential flashpoint, and the situation there is becoming increasingly tense as well.
This is getting really complicated. We've got the South China Sea, Taiwan, the U.S., China, and all these other countries caught in the middle. It's like a giant tangled web.
It is complex. But that's why it's so important to break it down and try to understand the underlying dynamics, because at the end of the day, this isn't just some abstract geopolitical game. Real people's lives are at stake.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Uh.
We've talked a lot about the military aspects and the strategic calculations, but what about the human cost of all of this? What happens to the people who live in these disputed areas if conflict breaks out?
The consequences would be devastating. We could see mass displacement, widespread casualties, and a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. And even if the fighting is contained, the economic and social impacts would be felt far and wide.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. And it's a reminder that we need to do everything in our power to prevent this conflict from happening.
We talked earlier about the importance of diplomacy, but what specifically could be done to de-escalate the situation?
One important step would be for all parties to agree to a code of conduct for the South China Sea.
A code of conduct.
Yes. This would establish clear rules for behavior and help to reduce the risk of miscalculation. It's been in talks for years, but China has been reluctant to sign on to anything that would limit their actions.
So it sounds like we're stuck in a bit of a stalemate, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around this whole idea of a code of conduct. What would that actually look like in practice?
Well, it could include things like prior notification of military exercises, agreements on fishing rights, and mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully. The goal would be to create a more predictable and stable environment, reducing the likelihood of accidental clashes.
It sounds like a sensible approach, but given the level of mistrust between the parties, I imagine it would be incredibly difficult to negotiate and implement.
You're right. It would require a significant amount of goodwill and a willingness to compromise on all sides, which seems to be in short supply at the moment. But it's still worth pursuing because the alternative is too dangerous to contemplate.
This has been incredibly informative. I feel like I'm starting to understand the complexities of this situation a lot better, but I'm also feeling a bit overwhelmed by it all. It's like a giant puzzle box, and every time we open a new layer, we find even more intricate mechanisms and potential consequences. A bit daunting, to be honest.
I understand. It is a lot to process, but that's why it's so important to have these conversations and to try to make sense of this complex issue, because the more we understand about what's at stake, the better equipped we are to demand peaceful solutions from our leaders.
I agree. And I think that's a good place to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still much more to explore. It's tricky, right? These Southeast Asian nations, they're caught in the middle of this superpower rivalry.
Oh, absolutely. It's like walking a diplomatic tightrope, trying to stay on good terms with both the U.S. and China without making either one angry.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned Vietnam having to do that. Are there other specific examples of these kinds of dilemmas these nations face?
For sure. Take Malaysia. They've traditionally had strong economic ties with China, but they also depend on the U.S. for security cooperation, particularly in maritime security.
So they need China for business, but the U.S. for protection.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And then you have countries like Indonesia, the biggest economy in Southeast Asia. They're trying to chart their own course.
Stay neutral.
Yeah, they don't want to get dragged into a conflict that doesn't directly benefit them.
It's almost like they're trying to build a bridge between two tectonic plates that are constantly shifting and grinding against each other.
That's a great analogy. They're trying to find that sweet spot where they can use their relationships with both superpowers to their advantage without getting crushed in the process.
We've talked about the potential for conflict, but what would actually cause these Southeast Asian nations to get involved?
Well, one scenario is a conflict between the U.S. and China that spills over into the region, maybe a confrontation over Taiwan.
Right.
These nations could find themselves being pressured to choose sides.
This is a nightmare for them.
Totally. Another possibility is that the conflict in the South China Sea itself escalates, pulling in neighboring countries.
Because of treaty obligations?
Right. Or simply because they're so close.
Like a brush fire spreading.
Exactly. And even if they manage to avoid direct military involvement, they could still face serious consequences. Economic fallout, social upheaval.
Disrupted trade.
Absolutely. An influx of refugees. Even cyber attacks.
So it's not just about picking sides in a war. It's about the broader impact on their stability and their well-being.
You got it. And that's why it's so important to consider their perspectives and understand the tough choices they're facing.
It reminds us that these conflicts that seem far away can actually have ripple effects that touch everyone.
For sure. It really underscores how important diplomacy and dialogue are, and a commitment to peaceful solutions. The stakes are just too high for things to get out of control.
So we've covered a lot today. The South China Sea has become this flashpoint with historical claims, military buildups, and a web of alliances making any misstep potentially disastrous.
It's complicated. There are no easy answers. But by understanding the motivations of the key players, China, the U.S., and the Southeast Asian nations in the middle, we can grasp how serious this situation is.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, right? Giving our listeners the knowledge they need to understand this complex world.
Exactly. And as you follow this situation, I want you to consider this. In this age of technology, how might artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons make things even more complicated in the South China Sea?
AI and autonomous weapons. We're already dealing with a powder keg as it is.
Think about it. We've already seen China investing heavily in these technologies. Their use could create a situation where decisions are being made by algorithms, not humans.
And that could speed up the conflict.
Potentially, and make it even harder to de-escalate.
It's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Exactly. It makes clear communication and finding diplomatic solutions even more urgent.
We've learned so much today about the forces at play in the South China Sea and why this matters to everyone. Thanks for guiding us through this.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, staying informed is the first step towards finding solutions. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep having thoughtful discussions about these critical issues.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay curious.
All right, diving right in today, we're tackling the South China Sea.
Oh, interesting.
It's heating up,
Yeah.
and we're looking at it specifically from the perspective of the Philippines.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a great documentary to guide us.
Right.
It's from DW Documentary on YouTube.
Okay.
It's called In China's Shadow, the Philippines at the Heart of a Global Conflict.
Catchy title.
It is.
What's it all about?
Well, they interview everyone.
Right.
Filipino fishermen, politicians, activists, international experts.
I see. Trying to get like a
The whole picture.
a broad perspective in this.
And what I really liked about it is that it shows the human cost of this conflict.
Something we don't always think about when we're talking about geopolitics.
Right. We get lost in the maps and the lines and
Exactly.
it's more than just territory. It's global trade, it's resources, it's, who's going to be the big power in the region.
Exactly. Yeah. The balance of power.
Yeah, so today we're going to try to untangle all of this, right?
Right. I'm ready.
Okay, so
Let's dive in.
let's imagine a huge body of water,
Okay.
bigger than the Mediterranean,
Wow.
teeming with islands and reefs.
That's a lot of islands.
That's the South China Sea,
right.
and China claims most of it.
Most of it, really.
Yeah.
Like, how much are we talking?
So much so that it even overlaps with areas that the Philippines considers their own special economic zone.
They're EEs, yeah.
Right, they're EEZ.
And those are important, right?
Yeah, EEZs are crucial.
They give a country special rights to explore and use the resources
Exactly.
within a certain distance of their coast.
Like fishing rights, oil, gas.
All sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and so when you have China coming in and saying like,
This is ours.
yeah, we claim this, and it's overlapping with where the Philippines says, no, this is our zone,
Right.
that creates problems.
Some problems.
Yeah, and this is where the 9-dash line comes in.
Ah, yes, the infamous 9-dash line.
Which, okay, so China has had this line on their maps.
For ages, like since the 1940s.
Yeah, but there's no basis in international law.
Right, it's essentially them saying,
We've always claimed this.
historically, this has been ours.
And to solidify that point even more, in 2016,
Oh, yeah.
the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague
Big court.
said that China's 9-dash line,
It doesn't hold up.
yeah, doesn't hold up.
Legally speaking,
No legal standing. But China's like,
we're good.
thanks for the opinion, but
We'll do our own thing.
yeah.
It makes you wonder what their end game is here.
Right. Is it just about resources?
Could be.
Or is there something bigger going on?
Are they trying to dominate the whole region?
Yeah, so many questions.
Somebody.
We need to zoom in on some specific areas.
Okay, where should we start?
Let's look at the Scarborough Shoal.
All right, I've heard of this place.
This is where we meet Tufonis.
Who's that?
He's a Filipino fisherman who actually testified at The Hague.
Wow, really?
And he still goes out fishing in these contested waters.
Even with all the tension.
Even with all the tension.
That's brave.
And he faces harassment from the Chinese Coast Guard.
Oh, wow.
Constantly.
So it's not just like a theoretical thing. It's actually happening?
This is real life.
Yeah.
This is happening to people.
Imagine you're just trying to do your job, you know. You're a fisherman.
Right.
You're going out to fish, and suddenly you have these
You're being blocked.
Chinese ships blocking you or chasing you off.
Tu actually said
What do you say?
that the court ruling was just a win on paper.
Oh, wow.
The Chinese Coast Guard is still harassing us.
So even though they won legally, it's not changing anything.
Nothing on the ground.
On the water.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just words.
Right.
On a piece of paper.
And it's not even just about the harassment.
Oh.
China is dredging the seabed.
Dredging?
Yeah, they're building artificial islands.
Like from scratch?
From scratch. And they're putting military bases on them.
No.
Air strips, missile systems.
That's a big escalation.
It is.
What does that mean for global trade?
Well, trillions of dollars worth of goods pass through the South China Sea.
I had no idea it was that much.
Every year.
Trillions.
If China controls this vital shipping route,
that gives them a lot of power.
it could impact everyone.
Everyone.
Globally.
Wow.
Think about prices of everyday goods.
Yeah.
Businesses.
Supply chains.
Yeah, so it's not just a regional issue.
It's a global issue.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then you add in
What else is there?
the oil and gas.
Right, I forgot about that.
Under the seabed.
So you've got these competing claims over resources. You've got the trade route.
Yeah.
You've got military buildup. It's
a mess.
a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, so how is the Philippines dealing with all of this?
Right, because it's like they're caught in the middle
They are.
between these superpowers.
And they've had shifting alliances over the years.
Oh, really? Tell me more about that.
So former President Duterte,
Okay.
he was seen as pretty friendly with China.
Pro-China, some would say.
Yeah, and some argue that actually emboldened China.
I can see that.
But now, under President Marcos Jr.,
Okay.
there's been a shift.
What kind of shift?
They're trying to build stronger ties with the U.S.
Oh, interesting.
and other Western allies.
So it's like a pivot away from China?
Yeah, it's a rebalancing act.
Makes sense.
You know-
They're trying to find their footing.
Yeah, and one of the most visible signs of this shift
Oh, yeah.
is the expansion of joint military drills with the U.S.
You mean like war games?
Yeah, they're called Bellicaton.
What's that mean?
It means shoulder to shoulder.
Oh, wow. That's powerful.
It is.
Sends a message.
It does.
Like, hey, we've got backup.
But we're not alone.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not alone in this.
What else are they doing?
Well, they've also expanded this thing called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement.
What a mouthful.
Yeah, EDCA.
Okay, EDCA, what's that?
This agreement gives the U.S. access to Philippine military bases.
Oh, wow. So they're really stepping up their cooperation.
They are, and under Marcos Jr., they've added 4 more bases.
Or more. Wow.
It's a clear signal.
To China, like, don't mess with us.
Right.
But it's not just about what's happening externally.
No.
There's a whole internal debate
Oh, absolutely.
within the Philippines about how to handle this.
Yeah, it's not a simple, like, pick a side situation.
There are a lot of different perspectives.
There are different voices, different concerns.
So it's not just black and white. There's a lot of gray area.
Yeah, it's complicated.
I bet.
And I think it's important to explore those internal struggles.
To understand the full picture.
Yeah, because the Philippines is in a tough spot,
No doubt.
trying to balance their own interests with these,
External pressures
external pressures.
from both sides.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a tough situation for sure.
It is.
Yeah, it's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
And, they've got people like Manuel Mamba.
Who's he?
He's the governor of Cagayan province.
Okay.
And he's actually pretty worried about these new U.S. bases
Why is that?
because his province is close to Taiwan.
Ah.
And
ah,
he's worried that if things get worse, his province could become a battleground.
That's a valid concern.
Yeah, he's thinking about the safety of his people
Of course.
and the economic impact, too.
Right, because war is bad for business.
Exactly. So it's not an easy decision.
No, it's a real dilemma.
And then you have student activists.
Okay,
Like
interesting.
Rans Jules and Ariel.
What are they saying?
Well, they're critical of both China's actions
Okay.
and the increased U.S. military presence.
So they're not on either side.
They're kind of like, we need a different way.
A third way.
Yeah, a third way.
Interesting.
And they're using platforms like TikTok to get their message out there.
TikTok, huh?
Yeah, they're talking about human rights violations.
Which is a big concern, especially with the Philippines' history with U.S. military involvement.
Right, it's not a perfect track record.
No, not at all.
So it's understandable that they're worried.
Yeah, they're trying to find a solution that works for everyone.
But it's a tough situation.
It is.
Because they're up against these powerful forces.
It's David versus Goliath.
Yeah, exactly.
But you know, it's interesting.
What?
This conflict with China has kind of brought the Philippines together.
Yeah, there's a sense of national unity.
Like they're all facing this threat together.
It's like a common enemy.
Exactly.
And this Atinito movement,
Let's say.
it's this citizen-led initiative. It means this is ours.
I like that.
It's all about supporting the Filipino fishermen
Okay.
and advocating for the Philippines' rights in the South China Sea.
So it's a way for people to stand up and say,
This is our territory.
we're not backing down.
Exactly. And they're doing things like there was this event
Oh, yeah.
with Senator Risa Hontiveros.
Okay, no.
She's a big opposition figure.
Right.
And she went to this fishing village called Masinloc. Okay.
For an At and Edo event.
So she's supporting the movement.
Yeah, and she stood there in front of all these fishermen.
Who have been harassed by Chinese forces.
Right, and she told them,
What'd she say?
the government is behind you.
Wow, that's a powerful message.
It was.
Like, we're all in this together.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that she actually recognized Tufonis.
The fisherman we were talking about.
Yeah, the one who testified at The Hague.
And she thanked him.
She did. She thanked him for his courage.
That's awesome.
So it's this moment of like,
Solidarity.
yeah, like we're all in this fight together.
It's pretty inspiring.
It is. And this unified front is really important for the Philippines
Why is that?
because it gives them more leverage
Okay.
when they're dealing with China.
I see, like a stronger bargaining position.
Yeah. And then you have things like the proposed maritime zones bill.
Oh, yeah? What's that about?
That's trying to formally enforce that tribunal's decision.
So they're actually putting it into law. Yeah, and clarifying the Philippines' maritime boundaries.
That's a bold move.
It is. It's sending a message.
To China. Like,
Yeah.
we're serious.
Yeah, we're not playing around.
But that could provoke them.
It could.
It's a risky move.
It is. But even with all of this,
The unity and the legal rulings.
the situation is still really tense.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
You have Chinese ships constantly around Philippine-claimed islands.
Like they're just lurking,
They are.
waiting for something to happen.
And there was that incident with the water cannons
Oh, I read about that.
where they were used against Filipino sailors.
That's scary.
Yeah, it's a dangerous game.
And then you have the Sierra Madre.
The Sierra
Those-
Madre.
That World War II ship
Yeah, that they intentionally grounded.
as a symbol of resistance.
Yeah, it's become this, like, icon.
China wants them to remove it.
Oh, yeah, they're not happy about it.
They've been blocking resupply missions, using water cannons, even threatening to tow it away.
It's become a real
The
flashpoint.
symbol of the whole conflict.
And it's brought us to this really important point.
What's that?
The U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty.
Ah, that's the big one.
President Marcos Jr. has said that he's ready to use it
If what?
if any Filipino serviceman is killed in an attack.
Wow, that's a big statement.
It is. It's basically saying
Don't even think about it.
to China.
Yeah. Or else?
So it's a huge risk.
It is.
Yeah.
Because what if China calls their bluff?
Right. What if they do attack?
Then what?
Then we could have a war.
It's a scary thought.
It is. And it's a reminder that this is a really delicate situation.
The Philippines is walking a tightrope
Trying to deter China.
without starting a war.
Yeah. It's a tough balancing act.
It is, and it's not clear how it's all going to play out.
Yeah, it's a high wire act for sure.
It really is.
But one thing the Philippines has been doing well
Oh,
is using media and publicity
Yeah.
to their advantage.
How so?
Yeah.
It's like,
The best defense is a good offense.
yeah. That's
So what are they doing?
You're sharing footage?
Oof. Of these confrontations, like the water cannon incident,
Oh, yeah.
they're inviting journalists on these trips to the islands.
To see it firsthand.
Yeah, and it's working.
It is.
It's getting international attention.
I see. They're getting their story out there.
Yeah, and China doesn't like it
Why not?
because it makes them look bad.
It does.
Especially when you see these videos
Like that one.
with the Chinese Coast Guard ship.
Tailing the tourists and journalists.
It went viral.
Yeah, I saw that one.
And the Sierra Madre,
Oh, yeah, the grounded ship.
it's become this,
Media magnet.
every time something happens there.
The whole world is watching.
And the Philippines is smart.
How so?
They're using this attention to highlight China's bullying tactics.
Yeah, it's making China look like the aggressor.
And it's getting people on their side.
I see. It's a smart strategy.
It's like David versus Goliath.
Using media to level the playing field.
Exactly.
But even with all the media attention,
it doesn't change the fact that,
they're outmatched militarily.
yeah, the Philippines is still at a disadvantage.
So what can they do?
Their hope lies in the U.S.
The alliance.
Yeah, at that mutual defense treaty.
But even that's not a guarantee.
You're right, there are no guarantees.
It's a complex situation.
It is. And internally,
Yeah, we can't forget about that.
President Marcos Jr. has inherited this really complex political landscape.
Shaped by Duterte's pro-China stance,
He's got to unify his people.
while dealing with pressure from both sides.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope.
And then there's Duterte's daughter,
The vice president.
a potential future president.
What if she brings back that pro-China stance?
It's a possibility.
It adds another layer of uncertainty.
It does.
So the future of the South China Sea,
It's up in the air.
yeah, so many factors at play.
It's overwhelming to think about.
It is, but what are some key takeaways
From all of this,
for our listeners?
I think the South China Sea conflict is a microcosm of what the world is facing today. Rising nationalism,
Yeah.
shifting power dynamics, this erosion of the rules-based order.
That we've all agreed to.
Exactly. And the struggle to find peaceful solutions.
To really complex problems.
Yeah, and we've only scratched the surface.
We've explored the human cost,
the difficult choices.
the global implications.
But there's always more to learn.
So keep researching.
Stay informed.
Talk about it.
Because understanding these challenges
Is the first step toward
something solutions.
It's a story that's still being written.
And we're all part of it.
And the choices we make
Will shape the future.
of the region.
And maybe even the world.
So until next time.
Keep diving deep.
And remember,
Even amidst all this uncertainty.
there's always more to learn.
And discover.
And we'll see you next time.